Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. Bruchim habayim. As we begin our session tonight, let me please remind you that we will be checking the chat throughout the evening. So if you have questions that you want to raise, we will do our very, very best to keep an eye on all the chats and to get your questions in. We also want to take note of the fact that we're using a transcription device today, so please pay attention to the bottom of the screen. And if you want to take part in that and just follow the live transcript, all you need to do is press the live transcript button and then either show subtitles or hide them so you can hear what's going on. This week, Jews around the world will read from Parshat Yitro and the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And our tradition teaches that the giving of the Torah took place outside of any country so that anyone could claim the teachings of Torah. But as we know, Torah is what has distinguished the Jew, made our practices different from any other people in the world. And amongst the many blessings, and there have been many, there have also been challenges. And our differences have often been the basis for anti-Semitism, certainly over the long night of exile. Interestingly enough, the rabbis noted that the same letters that are used to spell Sinai can also spell Sinah, hatred. And I think that they came from a place of knowing. The painful irony of our age is now that our people has reestablished itself in the modern state of Israel, Sinah, not Sinai, but Sinah, hatred has moved from a place in the wilderness to the Jewish homeland as well. All of us are aware of what a lightning rod Israel has become around the world, and in many cases, a foil for anti-Semitism. I don't need to tell this audience that Israel is not a perfect country, nor do you need to hear from me that a solution for the Palestinians and the Palestinian people needs to be found. Like any other country, the state of Israel is not above criticism. But the fact is that Israel garners more attention in the area of human rights than any other country on earth, far more than, say, Myanmar, North Korea, or Syria. The number of United Nations resolutions decrying Israel as compared to any other country, including Iran, is stunning. And the rise of intersectionality has put the Palestinian cause front and center and has made the vilification of Israel commonplace and in too many cases normalized. Nowhere is that more evident than on college campuses, where Apartheid Week is a yearly event on a number of campuses around the country and around the world. Professors regularly express negative opinions on Israel, challenge students who have a balanced, or dare I say, a positive understanding of the Jewish state. Amidst the COVID lockdown, the University of Illinois student body managed to pass its second BDS measure. As a campus Chabad official put it, Jewish students should never have to choose between standing up for social and racial justice while also having to shed their Jewish identity and their connection to the Jewish homeland to do so. So how do we think about life on college campuses? Because I can tell you, as someone who graduated from college in 1976, the world is a very different place. The challenges that young people that await young people on college campuses, especially Jewish students, are challenging indeed. And at Anshe Emet, we are very concerned about how we prepare our young people and how we share the messaging with a larger congregation. In a few weeks, next week, I should say, next Tuesday night, we will hear from a group of Hillel directors from around the country who will offer their assessment and their advice. But tonight, we will hear from two remarkable young adults who have had the courage to stand up to hate on their college campuses. And so let me tell you a little bit about our guests tonight, who are both seniors in college. Rose Ritch was forced to resign from her position as vice president in the student government of the University of Southern California because she not only espoused a love of Israel, but refused to denounce it. Rose had the courage to stand up to the torrent of abuse in a well-coordinated campaign against her. And in her resignation, she wrote a remarkable letter describing her views, her treatment, and being the caring individual that she is, challenged the student government to do better in the future. We welcome you, Rose. And we also have the pleasure of having Blake Flayton with us tonight. Blake is a senior at George Washington University. Since coming to George Washington, Blake became aware of a deep anti-Israel sentiment on campus, such as a social media video with a student saying, "We are going to bomb Israel, you Jewish pieces of," I'll let you fill in the last word. Blake, an avowed progressive, began to use his voice and his pen to stand up. He wrote a powerful op-ed piece in the New York Times, and he has been writing and speaking ever since. We welcome you, Blake, and thank you both for being with us. So, Rose, let me begin with you, and you'll both unmute yourself. That would be great, because people my age forget to do that all the time. So let me begin with you. Can you describe for us a bit about what happened to you after serving on the Student Senate and then as vice president in student government?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will preface this whole conversation by saying, briefly mentioning about the USC climate before this. We were very, very fortunate that for the most part over my entire time as a student, starting in 2017 when I was on campus, and even before that, we've been very lucky where we've had to encounter relatively little anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. You know, obviously maybe once or twice a year something happens, but it's usually on a very small scale, and it's nothing that we've ever seen as a form of concern before. So this was a very interesting experience for myself, and I think the entire USC Jewish community, because it was something we've never encountered to this intensity and to this the breadth that it was. And so this began originally as a campaign against the president who I ran on a campaign with due to allegations of microaggressions, of racial microaggressions, of things that he had said to Black students on campus during the campaign time. But very, very quickly, it did become a conversation of, oh, let's also get rid of Rose because she's a Zionist, and Zionists are responsible for police brutality, and they're responsible for racism, and they're responsible for, you know, this, and this issues that are both here in Los Angeles that we deal with constantly and also globally. And so it began on a Friday. I was at work around 10 o'clock in the morning, and then by 7 o'clock that night, there were massive cries also for my removal. I was getting pretty hateful, we'll use that word, pretty hateful direct messages. Comments were starting to pop up. I went off social media very, very quickly, but I had a really good group of friends who were, you know, keeping track, screenshotting things for me. And so I was watching this evolve. People also began to go after my sexual orientation in a couple of different tweets and Instagram comments and direct messages. And so, and very quickly, it just grew and grew and grew. And it went on for very consistently for about 2 weeks. Within that time, a student also did file a complaint, an official impeachment complaint to impeach myself and the president at the time. And it was accepted by the student senate. I would say what was something very frustrating that happened during this is within our bylaw obligation that a document we have, there is a professional staff that oversees the student government who are the ones who are supposed to decide whether or not the complaint warrants an impeachment or not. And they made the decision to not follow their bylaw obligation and to instead push it just to the Senate, say, hey, it was filed correctly, let's go to impeachment trial, we'll let this, the senators decide. And so an impeachment trial technically began. The president did resign fairly quickly after that began and never saw the impeachment trial. And shortly before my impeachment trial, about 4 days before, the administration made the decision to call off the impeachment trial, not because I had been brought into it because of identifying as a Zionist and a Jew, but because they cited insufficient bylaw processes. And so they said they were going to suspend the impeachment trial, you take the fall to review the processes, and then reevaluate later down the road. And so that was kind of was grateful for that, but it was frustrated that they wouldn't own up to why this was actually happening. Unfortunately, though, throughout this entire time, I continued to receive pretty hateful messages and having to deal with this. And it was very frustrating and very difficult. And our student cabinet, who helps to lead the organization, made the decision that they also wanted to resign. Multiple other things were happening. There were some other Zionist students who were also pushed out of student government. And so within about a month of this all happening, I did ultimately make the decision to step down for numerous reasons. Most of them being particularly, I felt I was frustrated that the failure of the administration to protect me in this instance. And I felt that if I was going to have to deal with this my entire term, I would not be able to be successful as I was going to be taking on the role as president. And I knew that if I was unable to, actually do my job as president, as an elected official, then there was no point in being there. And it was, again, a frustrating and very mentally difficult toll that it took. And ultimately made the decision to resign. And now here I am. Sorry, that was a little long.
No, not at all. It's a shocking story. It must have just been devastating for you.
Yes, it was definitely frustrating. A year ago we were in our campaign right now, and it was, you're so optimistic and hopeful. And we'd only really been technically in office for about 3 or 4 months at that point, and you had so much you wanted to accomplish. And with the pandemic, we had so many issues we wanted to address. But life throws me some curveballs sometimes.
That's what they say. Just as someone was asking, what percentage of the student body at USC is Jewish? Do you have any idea?
There's not an official number, but it's believed that anywhere between like 8 to 12% of the student body is Jewish. I'm not I think that's pertaining to just undergrad. So a decent amount, at least about 2,000 students are Jewish.
So you took the important step of writing a resignation letter. And if you don't mind, I'm going to quote part of your letter. We all have the right to our opinions and to disagree. But in today's day and age, our campuses have shifted from authentic in-person conversations to comments and retweets, and we cancel anyone with whom we disagree on any issue. There's a disturbing lack of nuance, our willingness to grapple with the messy complexities of an issue, and there is no longer any room for change or growth. Students made presumptions about my Zionist identity and leapt to unfair conclusions. No one asked me to explain my passion for Israel. No one asked to learn together, to try to understand and build connections. Instead, the people with whom I have shared a campus with for years, the people whom I desperately wanted to serve, have tried to make me feel ashamed, invalidated, and dehumanized because of who I am. Rose, why did you write this letter? Why didn't you just walk away?
Rabbi, I will say for sure, originally I really did want to I wanted to walk away quietly. I was kind of done with it. I was frustrated with what had happened. But I will say, and so this Barry Weiss's resignation letter came out rather maybe about 2 weeks before my resignation. And I think the bravery she displayed in that definitely really inspired me to write something and to acknowledge publicly what had happened. And I also had I will say, a really incredible support system around me from my Hillel director and other Jewish professionals, friends, who also felt that this was something I couldn't walk away quietly from. And I'm glad I didn't, because I think it was something that needed to be talked about. And I know I had friends from UCLA who unfortunately have to deal with this very, very, very frequently, who are like, this is nothing, like this happens to us all the time. But the reality is, like I said, this doesn't happen at USC. And I felt that the situation needed to be called out to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And the fact that, 3 Jews were kicked off of serving in elected positions in student government is not something that you can be quiet about.
Well, Barry Weiss is a friend of our congregation. We have a wonderful relationship with her, and she's an amazing mentor. But it must give you great comfort to know that your letter went viral. And we'll never really know how many students were inspired to stand up because they saw your words and were inspired by you. So thank you for that. And on behalf of all of us, we want to applaud your efforts. But let's turn to you, Blake. And we're going to now move to the colder side of the United States, the eastern portion. And if you would tell us a little bit about your experience on campus at George Washington.
Of course. So I arrived at GW very committed, very excited to get involved in progressive circles and in progressive causes. In fact, the reason why I moved to DC in the first place, the reason why I applied to DC schools, was because I wanted to be in the thick of it, a couple streets down from the White House, and be involved in protests and just all around advocacy work. However, when I became involved in these advocacy spaces, which I did, most notably protesting the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh and being involved in movements for reproductive justice and LGBTQ equality, there seemed to be a very obstinate and emotional passion against Israel. And it didn't really register in my brain as criticism. It didn't feel like it was coming from a place of, we're going to look around the world and view all these different countries and assess the things that they could be doing better. It was more of a manic kind of compulsion to denounce Israel at any opportunity, even when the conversation had nothing to do with Israel at all. And not only Israel, but by extension, Zionism, and by extension, Zionists. So kids and students who were pro-Israel, or who not even were pro-Israel, maybe didn't even identify as, being outwardly positive toward the Jewish state, but knew that dehumanizing, delegitimizing, and applying double standards to Israel felt wrong or left a bad taste in their mouth. They are, and it's not just at GW, of course, at USC, as we just heard, but across the country, they are made to feel othered and pushed outside of these spaces. And I'm hoping we can get into more of a conversation as to why sociologically and politically that's happening. It's actually a very long tradition of how anti-Semitism operates. But these students feel as though their voices are not being heard, that their presence is not wanted, and that they're, I guess, an impediment to the progressive mantras that are really, really, over the past 10 years, specifically shifting further and further and further to the left. So I experienced this firsthand. And, after that Snapchat video that you referenced at the beginning of this call, I realized that I could no longer stay silent. And especially when I had friends and roommates and people who I really felt close to took to their social medias after the Snapchat video came out to condemn the Jewish community and say things like, why are we standing up for this community when this community supports apartheid? Or why are we standing up for this community when this community does nothing to stand up for other people? Which clearly isn't true, and also weird characterization of the Jewish community, which at GW is upwards of 30% of the student body. And so I decided to write about it and really make my voice heard, and I'm glad that I did.
Well, you also got picked up by the New York Times, which is not a small matter. So let me quote from your op-ed piece. This is the reality of being a politically active Jew on many American college campuses. If you call yourself a Zionist because your family fled to Israel from a Middle Eastern country, as a means of survival, you are complicit in ethnic cleansing. If you call yourself a Zionist because your family fled Germany to escape a concentration camp, you are a colonialist. If you call yourself a Zionist because your family made Aliyah to Israel because of their religious or spiritual beliefs, you are complicit in apartheid. These are powerful words. But as I read them, I began thinking about both, Rose, your experience, and Blake, your experience on college campuses. And these are very fine universities in major metropolitan areas. And I began to think about the new AJC study on anti-Semitism, which is something that all of us should be familiar with. And that because of the rise of anti-Semitism in this country, American Jews are avoiding certain places or activities out of concern for their safety as Jews in greater numbers. Nearly 1 out of every 3 Jews, 31%, say they either always they always avoid certain places, events, or situations out of concern for their safety or comfort as Jews, and that applies to Jewish symbols, etc. In your experience on college campuses, do you see other students sort of hiding, kind of falling in that framework, or finding the means to stand up? Blake, I'll begin with you. What do you think?
Yeah, so just to preface this, you said that you graduated from school in 1976.
Moses was in my graduation class.
Which is a year after a day that former Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan described as one that would live in infamy. And that was when the United Nations passed Resolution 3379, noting that Zionism was akin to racism. And that, I guess, ingenious but also diabolical proposal that flipped the war against Israel from the right to the left has seeped into institutions all over the world. And suddenly anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism is no longer a right-wing aggressive issue to, push Jews into the sea. Suddenly it is a right-wing imperialist view. Suddenly it is a left-wing progressive view to ridicule Zionism, to curse Israel, and to denounce the Jewish state. And so when you are in a space where that lesson, where that rhetoric has been institutionalized by professors, by scholarship, by journalists, by diplomats, by members of the media, as Rose said, it pertains to cancel culture, where this thing has been marked as racist, this thing has been marked as evil, as bigoted, as right-wing, and nobody can ever say or do anything to dissuade others from believing that, because it has already been marked as something really, really bad and negative.
And yet most of the students have not visited Israel and know actually very little about the history of the country.
Exactly.
And yet they have formed these very powerful opinions. How do you understand that? And then I'm going to turn to you, Rose.
It's because they've been told. And I always say that when a progressive student arrives on campus, a progressive Jewish student even, they think to themselves, when they see these activists, they see these advocates for leftist causes, they think to themselves, well, if I agree with these people on A through Y, I must also agree with them on Z, Z being Zionism. even though I've never been to Israel, I don't know anything about Israeli culture. You know, Israel was never really a part of my Reform Judaic life. Um, I must agree with them because they obviously know a lot more about it than I do. And why would I disagree with them on this one thing when I agree with them on everything else? And so that's why you a lot of times see Jewish students join that cause, join that effort, because they convince themselves and they're convinced by others that they've been brainwashed into supporting something that shouldn't be supported. But then you see a lot of Jewish students who hear Jewish students who hear the jargon, who hear the political yelling and the contentious environment that it causes on campus, and they just tap out. They say, I don't want to get involved in that. It's not really worth it to me. There's too many moving parts. I don't really understand the language. So I'm just going to not engage and let people kind of scream at each other in the auditorium during a BDS vote and have no part of it. And I think that speaks to a lot of what we need to be incorporating into Jewish education, because too often, for young people, because too often Jews arrive on campus and they don't know how to defend Israel because they've never been taught the rhetoric and the reasons why they should support Israel. They can't say, well, look how great their cherry tomatoes are, and you know how fun my cousin's bar mitzvah was on top of Masada. You know, that's not good enough to defend the Jewish state. So they run out of ideas, they run out of things to say, and they either completely back out and let others handle it, or because they're progressive, because they're left wing, they allow that rhetoric to change their own minds and their own narrative.
Weren't there people that came to you, Rose, and said, Rose, what are you doing? Why are you putting yourself out there like this? Why don't you just like take a step back? Was that something you heard on campus, or is it your experience that you see Jewish students backing away, trying to kind of go under the radar?
Yes and no. I think it's something, again, because it's not so much of an outward issue, at least for the most part at USC, that we've had to deal with. I think we have been really lucky that their Jewish students have felt comfortable walking into Jewish spaces, wearing a Magan David, wearing a yarmulke, you know, walking in and, you know, physically presenting as Jewish, whatever that may mean. But I also know at the same time, there's been many students who in classes where they've had professors, you know, say some things that either, you know, very blatantly anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. I think you also have a lot of Jewish students coming onto campus, and I will put myself in this boat of not necessarily identifying as a Zionist. I was Jewish, and all of my Jewish values and what was part of my Jewish identity were Zionist values, but I never actually used the label to identify myself that way, honestly, until this whole experience happened and people began identifying me as that. So I think a lot of students are constantly negotiating with themselves. When do you speak, you know, when do I go and talk to my professor about how that comment made me uncomfortable, or when do I report it? Or when do I just step back and have to say, you know what, I need to get an A in this class. I don't need, you know, I'll go tell maybe somebody at Hillel so somebody knows, or I'm gonna tell all my friends so they don't take this professor, but, you know, I don't really wanna say anything right now. But I will say with my experience, I think I was getting overwhelming support to say something. And I had if any people that I can think of telling me not to say something, because I think many of us recognize in the USC community that this was something that needed to be said and needed to be addressed. If anything, I think I was the one pushing back in the beginning. I was very scared, I'll be honest. I was really, really scared to say something, because you want to move on with your life and not have this follow. And I never anticipated this letter would the coverage and the viral component of it that it did. That I don't think none of us did. And so even with that, not thinking it was going to be this big, I was still very scared. But I had a lot of, again, amazing people saying, oh, you need to do this. And me saying, yeah, I need to do this.
So I want to also include questions that are coming in. So here's a question that comes from Elisa Arbach. And she says that she's very sorry about what happened to Rose and deplored the fact that you were driven out of student government because of your views. and I am not a Zionist in the sense that many people would think of a Zionist. However, she writes, Fordham University has barred Students for Justice in Palestine, which I feel is also a crackdown on freedom of speech. How would you respond to the censorship of SJP? This is a question for both panelists. Thank you. And then there's a follow-up to that by David Lerner, which we want to look at as well. But go ahead. Blake, you want to pick this up?
So I disagreed with the Fordham decision. I'm a person who is a strong advocate for academic freedom and for freedom of speech on campus. And I believe, wholeheartedly that campuses need to be a space where people can exchange ideas in an environment that is not threatening. And I do believe that to be the bedrock of liberal democracy. However, we can't take that one instance to distract from what SJP's campaign has been over the past several years. So although I disagree with that decision, and I don't believe that any organization should be barred from campus, also because I believe that ideas that are not heard are ideas that grow underground, and that ideas that grow underground are ideas that become stronger and more violent. But I also think it's irresponsible to take out of the equation the reason why SJP is met with such hostility because of their very well organized, very well funded campaign against not only Zionism, but against Jewish people and Jewish culture on campus.
So let me just extend this a little bit farther, because when David Lerner responds to the question, he notes that he purports that intersectionality is really the issue, and that this railroads progressives into an anti-Israel sentiment. Would you agree with that, Rose? Is that something that you would support?
I would say, repeat the question one more time. Sorry, I'm just trying to.
What role do you think intersectionality plays in this debate? Does it sort of drive progressives into down a road that they might not be thinking of, but simply because it's part of a kind of a larger culture in the progressive universe, in the woke progressive universe?
I think it has the. Thinking this is a good question. It's something that I think with progressivism and intersectionality, I think it has a potential to be incredibly beneficial and lift up so many voices. But how I've seen it, especially I would say maybe over the past year or so, it's been used as a tool to exclude certain people from these spaces. And Jews is one of those groups. And so when it's utilized in the right way, like I said, I think it's very important. I think, like, for example, like with the Jewish community and talking about Zionism and talking about how, there is an argument that the Zionism, that the Jews returning to Israel is a decolonization movement. It's a successful return to indigenous lands. And so with that, we should be able to successfully, interact and have an intersectional conversation, with Native Americans, for example, or people from Tibet or other places where there is a drive and a need to return to indigenous lands because of colonization. But because of what's happened, for example, in SJP and in many parts of the progressive spaces in general, Israel's been demonized, Israel's been deemed, an apartheid, a colonizer, baby murder, all those things. Zionism is racism, Zionism is everything wrong with the world. You can't ever have those conversations that I think are so important. And I think also, I think because it's been so ingrained into this institution of progressivism, I think there's just so many people that, maybe 5 years ago or when they were younger would have the conversation, but just because of how it's changed into, people don't even want to have the conversation anymore. They're just so ingrained in these beliefs and these ideas.
So let's hold that thought for a minute, because Sharon raises this question. She says, she's asking, is this experience exclusive to Progressive Universe? Or do students who are more conservative or more to the right, are they also experiencing these issues, or is this unique to the Progressive Universe? What do you think, Blake?
So this actually kind of ties into the intersectionality question in an interesting way. And this is what I was talking about earlier in the call, and I promise I'm going to make it relate to conservative students, politically conservative students. But anti-Semitism since day one has been the most successful and effective political coalition builder in the history of mankind. In Europe, how do you get communists and capitalists and nationalists and internationalists and people speaking different languages and rich people and poor people to agree on one thing, to vote for one political party? You make the Jew, or the Jewish collective people, the face of everything that is wrong in your lives and everything that is wrong in the world. The Arab League in 1945 that was established, the Arab countries could not agree on a single thing. There were too many moving parts in all of their countries, like economics, like religion, like ethnicity, like language. But the one thing they agreed on was opposition to the Jewish state, no Jewish state. That was what's forged their alliance. On college campuses, it's the same thing. And this is why intersectionality is, if not in intent, but in effect, anti-Semitic, because it has all of these groups, these different advocacy organizations, the LGBTQ community, the racial justice movement, the environmental justice movement, the movement for labor rights, and a $15 minimum wage, and all these progressive movements. What is the one thing that can bring them together to form a coalition? Opposition to Zionism, because Zionism is everything that is wrong with the world. It is, as Rose said, colonialism, which is the most detested act of mankind that we see today, and specifically in progressive circles. It is racism, it is apartheid, it is genocide. That sort of coalition building doesn't really happen on conservative sides. It doesn't really happen on the conservative side of the aisle. You don't really see a lot of conservative groups on the quad, who are representing different forms of conservatism, like, maybe like a pro-life organization, or maybe a, nuclear energy organization, or maybe a deregulation organization. You don't really see them on campus, and you don't see them rallying around an issue like anti-Semitism. So it's actually funny, like your question is like, you'd think that these progressive spaces would think of conservatism and republicanism as the ultimate source of evil, as the ultimate face of evil. But that's not effective enough. That doesn't elicit enough emotion. That doesn't elicit enough passion. Zionism is what elicits the most strong reactions. So, and by extension, Zionism has been made to embody all of the most atrocious aspects of the extreme far right. So there's very intricate political decisions happening here. But no, I would say that conservatives don't experience the same targeting, and they don't experience the same marginalization simply because you can't build a coalition around opposition to political conservatism. It's been tried and has failed. But building a coalition against Jewish students and what they represent and what their culture represents, as history has shown us and has proven to us, that is very successful.
Well, now that we have, I just want to there are a couple questions I want to get to. And this, because I don't want to leave this, because this is actually directed to you, Blake, from Yonatan, which is, where would you draw the line between free speech and hate speech? Do you think groups that promote hate speech should be barred? And if so, how doesn't SJP cross that line?
That is a multi-million-dollar question that a 20-year-old college student such as myself can only provide so much expertise on, because, I mean, you could look at what's happening with Twitter and Facebook right now, where who gets to decide what's free speech and what's hate speech, or what kind of speech incites violence that gets you kicked off social media platforms. It's really tricky, and it's a really slippery slope. SJP their activism against Israel, as I said before, is not criticism. JVP's activism against Israel is not criticism. It is a fundamental, sorry, there's a car. Apologies. Um, their movement is a fundamental rejection of any manifestation of Jewish peoplehood. They interrupt Israeli speakers. They protest Israel events. We were holding an event in the Quad a couple years ago where we were simply eating hummus and answering questions from a TV Israeli reality host, trivia questions about Israel. Very simple. We weren't even wearing anything that, made us a target. And a group of students came and unfurled a Palestinian flag and started screaming "from the river to the sea" and handing out flyers that saying Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. That's not free speech. That's not criticism. That's not academic freedom. That is the choice to single out one group of students on campus, to make them the focal point, and to constantly disparage them, make them the subject of social media mobs, as Rose can attest to, and really just tarnish their image on campus and make them out to be this pariah. Because Zionism is racism. And if you agree with Zionism, then ipso facto, you're a racist. And as Rose, our mutual friend Barry Weiss says, and we all know how racists should be treated on campus.
So, Rose, what's the biggest lesson you've learned from this experience?
I would definitely say, I think my biggest takeaway is to, harder said than, easier said than done, but to, I think, speak out and to call attention to this, because I will say at the end of the day, it makes me wonder for, my friends who have had professors or who've had classmates or who've read textbooks or who have encountered, different forms of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, either on our campus or other campuses. What would the conversation look like if they had spoken out? And it's not to say that they need it, I blame them, or I think anyone should blame them, because it's an incredibly hard, difficult thing to do. But I think to say, to call attention to it and to at least acknowledge it in some capacity, that this is happening, and that this is a valid experience, that it is a form of trauma in some capacity, and that it's painful, and that it's something that unfortunately we've been experiencing for thousands of years at this point. So I think at the end of the day, to use your voice and to say something. And I will say I'm a bit of a hypocrite saying this, because, I went on social media about 6 months ago and I haven't gone back on. And I know right now that's a very popular platform to speak out about this and to call attention to it. And that's something I'm choosing not to participate in. But at the same time, I think, when you have those opportunities in a moment, take it, use it. It will not be easy, but I promise you there will be good people around you who will help you get through it.
So on your campuses, did the administrations, were they helpful to you? Were the larger Jewish communities helpful to you? I think, Rose, you mentioned Hillel was very supportive, but do you find that the college administration itself has been helpful at all? Or do you, what's your experience, Rose, and what's your experience, Blake?
I would say when I was going through it at the time and kind of in this, blur, not sleeping, not eating, like just watching, every literally hour by hour watch, things continue to fall apart. I was lucky that I was in a position of some power, because I'd spent the past couple of months, cultivating relationships with the administration. So I texted with them. I met weekly with with many of them. We talked. And so I was lucky in that sense that I knew these people so personally. And so I was like, oh, they're just trying to do their jobs, they're in a tight spot, they're trying to not, ruin the autonomy of student government, or they're not trying to, do this and that, because I'd been in that position and I understood. But as it continued and looking back on it now, now 6 months ago, no, they did not do nearly enough. And I think they really, quite frankly, to a certain degree, failed their jobs as university administrators to protect a student. And unfortunately, I would say this is not the first time that they've failed to do that, not in regards to Jewish students, but to students of other religious, cultural, racial groups. I think that's been a problem. And so this was not the first time and will probably not be the last time that it happens either.
And Blake, what's your experience?
I didn't have a single professor reach out to meet with me after my New York Times piece came out. I had one member of faculty reach out for a quick 15-minute coffee date in his office. And that was so shocking. The high of, hearing all of this praise and connecting with all of these people who all around the world connected with my experience or were proud of me or, wanted to ask me questions was amazing. And I had to ground myself a couple weeks afterwards and say, why hasn't anybody from my own school, apart from Jewish community leaders, said anything? And it relates back, this is sort of my passion. It's kind of what I'm writing about and researching and advocating for. It all comes down to intersectionality and the theory on campus that everything and anything is a power structure. And Jews, as also demonstrated by the latest rendition and earlier renditions of the California Ethnic Studies curriculum, Jews are placed at a spot on the pyramid of oppression that is privileged and powerful and protected and influential. And so that creates two things. One, anybody can say anything they want about Jews, about Zionism, about Jewish culture, no matter how offensive or over the line or insensitive it is. And it is seen as speaking truth to power and social justice. And two, on the flip side of that coin, if a Jew speaks out and says, I have experienced anti-Semitism, these are my experiences, it's not taken seriously. It's brushed off as people being dramatic, people over-exaggerating, people telling half-truths, people being sensitive to criticism of Israel, all of that. And I think that had a really big part in why there was such a radio silence.
How do you differentiate between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Are they the same thing? Would you use the IHRA definition about anti-Semitism? I'm quoting from Jason Friedman's question. Since all of Europe and the UK have accepted it, but there's a pushback in progressive spaces. So how do you differentiate between the two ideas? What do you think, Rose? How do you differentiate between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
I would say how I see it, and I think this is definitely something that's very a hot topic of debate within the Jewish community right now. But for me, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism kind of fits inside of anti-Semitism. When I say anti-Semitism, I could be referring to a swastika appearing on campus, or I could be referring to what Blake experienced on his college campus in regards to the criticism and the horror of saying we're going to bomb Israel. But I would also then say, anti-Zionism is kind of a subcategory of that, where it relates to specifically criticism pertaining to Israel.
And existential questions as to whether Israel has a right to exist and things of that.
Absolutely, all of those sorts of questions.
What would you answer that, Blake?
Well, when people say, does Israel have a right to exist? I say that question is irrelevant. Israel exists. This isn't a cafe in 1920s Vienna. The question has been answered. Sovereign Jews exist in the Middle East. Period. End of story. And when we talk about anti-Zionism, we have to approach it in a broader context of the history of the Jewish people. During our exile in Europe, in the beginning of it, we were specifically a religious community when theocracy ruled and the Catholic Church had kind of an iron grip on affairs. So we were hated for our religion. when the Enlightenment came and Jews became secular, and all of a sudden we were a people and a nation rather than just specifically a religious group, we were hated for our race and, dirtying and muddying the racial purity of Europe. And now when Jews exist as a nation state, we're hated for our sovereignty. We're hated for our rights to self-determination, our rights to govern ourselves in our indigenous homeland, and our rights to have a seat at the table of our own in the arena of international affairs. It is the same story over and over again, and it says that Jews have absolutely no right to exist as a collective people with the same rights and liberties as everybody else. And anti-Zionism says, out of all of the states in the world, out of all of the sovereign countries with defined borders that grow from a place of shared history, shared culture, shared language, even some remnants of religion, only one is a crime against humanity. Only one's very nature is sinful and oppressive. And again, anti-Zionism is never criticism of Israel. It is never saying Bibi Netanyahu should be indicted. It is never saying that the occupation or presence of settlements or Israeli soldiers east of the Green Line should not exist. It says that Jews, you have no right to be in a majority civilization in the most hostile region of the world, where up until recently, all of the countries, their top of the list main goal was to see that state no longer exist. It speaks in the language of social justice, which is simply a front to make it more appealing to liberal-minded, forward-thinking people. But in actuality, it is a annihilationist form of justice and very violent at its core.
First of all, I have to say that both of you are very good on your feet, and we're throwing some pretty hard questions at you. And I know that I speak for everyone on the call, on this Zoom call, when I say how impressive both of you are, and your courage to stand up. But a lot of how would you advise students coming to college who gravitate towards advocacy issues, just as both of you do, and that they want to get involved in activist spaces and want to make friends with ideological compatriots, but who are Jewish and Zionist? How would you suggest that they navigate navigate these waters? Rose, we'll start with you.
I will first preface by saying that for 99.9% of Jewish students who walk onto the college campus, very little of your time should and most likely will be actually occupied by fighting BDS, having these conversations, having to deal with this, because I think at the end of the day, obviously it is a bad and legitimate issue, but there are other parts of college, and this is not what most Jewish students' experiences evolve around. Most. I know that there are some, and Blake can correct me, but I think a big part of his experience has definitely been around this. But for most of us, this is not the case. But I would say you walk onto campus, and I think for us who have been involved in activist spaces, you have to make space for yourself. And it's very hard to walk into a room and be in a space where you might have to compromise your Jewish identity. I know for me, I've had to walk into progressive spaces, and me as a queer Jewish woman, I sometimes felt like, especially in the beginning, I had to kind of, literally take my Magen David off and kind of just put that aside and be there as just a queer woman, because that was more acceptable than being a queer Jewish woman. But now I would say over the past year, and especially in the past 6 months, I think walk in and own it and make space for yourself, because there are not enough spaces on college campuses. And I would say not enough spaces even within the broader Jewish community. I know there's Zioness and other organizations that promote this, but having a space to the intersection, whether it's a good or bad thing, but to be a Jewish progressive, be Jewish in this, Jewish in that, not enough spaces exist. And so you have to just kind of walk in and put your elbows in a little bit and say, hey, I belong, I'm here. I have a right to be here. This is a space, like, let me be here. And I assure you, being the first one in the room will be very challenging, but I you will watch more people come in after you. So getting your foot in the door, that's the hard part. But once you do that, I think you'll find there's a lot of students who share that same belief and who share those identities with you, who also want to be in the room and maybe were too afraid before.
Very powerful. How would you answer that question, Blake?
There is a very seductive pull that I spoke about earlier when you enter progressive spaces or advocacy spaces to shed part of your Jewish identity, to say, I was brainwashed, you're right, I agree with you on everything else, I'm going to agree with you on this too, either for political reasons that I've convinced myself of or you've convinced me of, or simply for social reasons that I want to be friends with you and I don't want to be not invited to parties just because I dare to say that Jews have a right to sovereignty in the Middle East. And tragically, that pull is increasing. And Dara Horn wrote an article in Tablet a couple of years ago called The Cool Kids about the Jews of the Soviet Union who were convinced that if they joined the Stalinist Soviet forces, if they accepted communism, if they renounced Zionism and renounced any connections to their Jewish family that they had in Europe, if they renounced Hebrew, if they renounced Torah, that it would be fine for them, that it would be safe and they would be exalted as heroes and accepted into the ideology. And push came to shove and they were all sent to gulags, or most of them were sent to gulags, or many of them disappeared. So it doesn't work. It won't be enough to shed part of your Jewish identity, whatever part of that may be, depending on the era in which we live in. It won't be enough. You will always be unacceptable to these people because of Jewish particularism and because of Jewish culture. So I describe Zionism in before 1948, Jews never had a seat at the table. And in 1948, Jews pulled up a folding chair. And that's perfectly analogous to what's the situation on campus too. Pull up a folding chair, speak your mind, come with your whole self, your whole truth, your whole opinions about these matters, your entire breadth and depth of Jewish identity. And if that's not working, if you still isolated, then find comfort in your Jewish community. Then find and build other spaces where you can have academic freedom, where you can talk about these issues in a non-judgmental, non-cancel culture type environment. That's what the spirit of Jewish self-determination is. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? I'm not going to have to rely on you for my safety and for my comfort. If you're not going to give it to me, that's fine. I'm going to do it myself. And that's the mindset that I went into writing the New York Times piece and the Tablet piece and my activism on social media and also publications throughout the last couple months, is that we can't apologize and try to dig a space for ourselves when that fate has already been sealed shut.
The times that we're living in are so remarkably complicated. Anti-Semitism, as I think we're all aware, no matter how you define it, is bubbling over in so many different areas. And at the same time, ironically, you have the Abraham Accords, where Israel is creating treaties with countries that we would have never thought would join together with Israel, whether it's the UAE or Bahrain, Sudan, or most recently Morocco. And one wonders how that will affect this conversation. And at the same time, how do you balance your feelings about the Palestinians and a just outcome for them? How do you balance all of those areas, and how important is it for Jewish students to be able to argue that point as well, to be open on that issue as well, in a balanced way? What do you think, Blake?
So that's a lot of questions. I'll start with the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords are resented in the progressive community for a lot of reasons. One being that they came under the supervision of the wrong president. And two being that Israel is seen as the bad guy in the Middle East, right? And that is the narrative that is formed around Israel and especially the Arab states, that these are corrupt, evil regimes that oppress people. And that's the end of the story. What they fail to realize is the remarkable transformation of the idea of the Jewish people in specifically the most institutionally anti-Semitic region in the world. Use the analogy of Israel and the Middle East to Jews on college campuses. It's, I'm not going to go away. I'm not going to be silent, and I'm not just going to disappear or fall into the sea. I'm here to stay. Either make peace with me, and I'll make peace with you, or expect a continued, relentless, and unnecessary conflict because of your persistence that I have no right to be here and I have no right to present myself with my full identity. And a transition goes to the same thing with the Palestinian issue. I accept a Palestinian state wholeheartedly. I accept Palestinian liberation, a Palestinian society living alongside an Israeli society. Why don't you accept Israel? Why don't you accept Jews having the same right as you do? So there's a compulsion in the Jewish community to try to play defense, where it's like, oh, but I accept, I advocate for Palestinian human rights. I'm for a two-state solution. I'm, against settlement buildings. I'm against checkpoints. I'm against home demolition. That's all well and good, and we need to be, relaying those progressive ideas in Zionism itself. But it's also beneficial to flip that conversation around and saying, I'm willing to accept you. And in fact, it's mandated that I accept you. It's only reasonable and rational and moral that I accept you. Why can't you accept me? And we see really interesting connections between the Jewish individual and the state of Israel, particularly with that kind of sociological conflict.
It's a great answer. I want to ask one last question. If a student came up to you after hearing you speak and said, I still don't get it. I don't really understand why I should support Israel. I'm Jewish, but I just don't understand why I should stand with Israel. What's your elevator speech to that person, Rose?
This is a hard one for me to answer because I come from a background that really promotes relationships with people. So I think like getting to know somebody first, what are they passionate about? What are they interested in? What do they care about as human beings? I think helps to, develop the pitch, so to speak. Are they passionate about LGBTQ issues? Water technology, this, that, indigenous return, all those different things. So I would say, and I would suggest this, I think it really is important to talk to somebody from a place of, what do they care about? What are they interested in? Because I could go and give all these different facts and talk about, make it about me, talk about my experience, yada, 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 all of that. But at the end of the day, I don't think that oftentimes doesn't really resonate with people. I think you kind of have to flip the conversation and make it about them and what they care about. Sorry, that's not the most concrete, direct, aligned view, but I think that's a really important thing. And not just in talking about Israel, but in progressive spaces, talking about coalition building, talking about, for people who may not like it, that I'm, not straight, like that is an important thing when I go into those spaces to talk about, to build that relationship with them. I think it's something that's been helpful for me in many facets and many aspects of my life.
What about you, Blake? By the way, it's a long elevator ride, but it's a great answer and a very nuanced and thoughtful one. So thank you, Rose. Go ahead, Blake.
I don't like asking people or telling people why they should support Israel. Would I tell a French person why they should support France? Pourquoi la France? Like, why is that a country? Would I ask a Chinese individual why they should support China, or lecture people on why they should support countries and governments and programs within the country? No, because the countries exist. The question needs to be, why don't you support the existence, the bare bones foundation of this one place that is smaller than New Jersey? It needs to be not what I like about Israel and like I said before, cherry tomatoes and my cousin's bar mitzvah and masada and all that kind of thing. It needs to be, why is this still a conversation? Israel exists. Hatikva exists. The Star of David flag exists. I don't need to justify its existence to you. It already is a thing. And that, in my experience, has been a lot more effective because it switches the table and it realizes it makes people realize why are we singling out just one country and not criticizing its policies and not criticizing its government or actions taken by deliberative bodies like a judiciary? Why are we saying that it has no right to be there at all? Like, why are we saying that its very foundation is illegitimate? And then the light bulb goes off in people's head where they're like, oh, this isn't really about what Israel says or does, or its treatment of Palestinians, or the allegations leveled against Benjamin Netanyahu. This is about the fundamental rejection of Jews having the same rights as everybody else. And that light bulb going off in freshmen, I see it in their eyes. It's like amazing. Like it's once you're no longer on defense, once you're on offense, it really does make all the difference.
Rabbis say, "B'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel lihiyot ish." In a place where there are no people of stature or values, strive to be such a person. I think I speak for everyone on this Zoom call when I say that you two have really fulfilled the ideals of that. You both have stood up. You both have made your voices heard. But what we also see in you are two people who are are listeners, thoughtful, and weigh your answers and offer us a lot of hope as we go forward. The reality is that the challenges that both of you have met on college campuses won't end at the end of your college career. That there is, and we see this in a whole variety of ways. And the other students on the college campus that are getting a very narrow view of Israel are going to carry that view forward. And so it's vital that we are part of the conversation and that we not only stand together, but we are thoughtful in our approach, thoughtful in our answers. And as you both have taught us through example, to not shy away from your own values, to stand up for what you believe in and let no one take your seat away from the table. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank everyone for joining us this evening. And we'll hope many of you will join us next week when we meet with Hillel directors. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rose.
Thank you.